Hi YouTube, this is Energy and I'm just creating a series on ethical atheism to help explain why religious people shouldn't be afraid of atheists and that atheists can indeed be ethical people. So this is part 1, which is morals, fairness and trust. Let's start out by confirming that ethical atheism is not a contradiction. So the question is, does atheism exclude ethics and morality? The short answer is of course no. Atheism simply means not believing in God. It makes absolutely no reference to ethics or morality. You can be an ethical atheist or you can be an unethical atheist. Both possibilities exist. Likewise, do all Christians act morally or ethically? The short answer is no. There are many Christians who commit adultery, murder, etc., but so long as they sincerely believe Christ is their Lord, I think you'd find it a hard time not to acknowledge that they are Christian. So, before we get underway, some very important definitions. Good, as far as I'm concerned, means something that benefits society. Ethics is a set of rules to do good for society, and that's a very interesting little statement, to do good, and will be the core issue that we deal with in this series. To be moral is to act ethically, i.e. to follow that set of rules to do good for society, and ethical means to behave consistent with the ethics. Fair is to treat people consistent with your ethics. And trust, of course, is another important concept, which is just being predictably reliable. So I can trust, for example, that when I lift a pen up and let it go, that the law of gravity will hold and that the pen will fall to the ground. Now, an ethical framework is ethics adopted by a person, i.e. what ethics they use. The important thing with this whole discussion of ethics is not to confuse the wrapping with the chocolate. So, society needs people to be moral and fair in order to function properly. Okay, but just because it needs people to be moral and fair doesn't mean it needs people to be religious. Sweden, for example, is 85% atheistic. So long as people are moral and fair, as they tend to be in Sweden, society functions just fine. Another thing you might have noticed is that most religions share similar core ethics, because those ethics have been evolutionarily chosen because they benefit society, i.e. they are good. Now, religion is just a wrapping for an ethical framework, and it can be a very inconsistent framework indeed. Just look at your Holy Scripture to confirm that. You know, the Bible condones slavery, etc., even though to most ethical people in this day and age, slavery is considered an abominably unethical thing to do. So what's the basis of an atheistic morality? The short answer is science. Atheists are all about finding evidence. So is science. So let's look at the evidence that nature has provided us for a morality. So evolution shows that individuals that cooperate will outcompete individuals that can't cooperate. So the short answer here is evolution wants us to cooperate. You know, a lot of people will think evolution means everyone's out for themselves, which effectively they are, but through cooperating, they can be out for everyone's benefit. You know, it's not a zero-sum game. Now, anything that helps us to cooperate will give us an evolutionary edge. Morals, fairness, and trust help us to cooperate, so it is encouraged by evolution. See, evolution is showing us the way for what is good for society, i.e. what it is to be moral and fair, much more so than any religious dogma that, encourages slavery, etc., etc. Now, cooperation is good for society because people who can cooperate can specialize in particular fields. Now, through specialization, experts no longer have to learn things they can rely on others to do. I don't need to learn plumbing if I can just hire a plumber, for example. And this ability to not have to worry about being a jack of all trades means that experts can have more time to learn their own field and they have more brain space they can devote to it. I don't need to learn about plumbing, so I don't have to spend any time learning about plumbing, and I don't need to devote any of my mental capacity to remembering details about plumbing. So specialization means that people are better able to specialize in their field than a non-specialist. So I know a lot more about physics than the average person because I've spent a lot more time learning about physics, because the average person doesn't really want to be bothered spending any time on learning about physics. Likewise, computing, etc. Now, specialization is good for society, alright? Therefore, cooperation is good for society. Now, specialists can do their job much quicker than a non-specialist due to more experience, and they can do a better job than a non-specialist due to more experience. They don't repeat past mistakes, okay, which means they don't get slowed down by them. So a specialist is quicker and better at task completion than a non-specialist, therefore they are more productive than a non-specialist, and this higher productivity makes society evolutionarily more fit. Now, there are a few things you need to have in order for specialization to be able to work in a society. First point, of course, is fairness. People need to be able to know, first of all, what they can expect in exchange for their efforts, and secondly, that those efforts will be fairly rewarded. Otherwise, why would you bother undertaking a task for somebody if you're not going to get fairly rewarded? Now, humanity has evolved to punish unfairness. Research has shown consistently, time and time again, through, for example, the Ultimatum game, which you can check out on Wikipedia, that we are prepared to take financial losses and other forms of losses in order to punish people we judge as unfair, because we've evolved to realize that society needs us to be fair with each other. So we've evolved to, as individuals, punish those who are bad for society. And that's an important point. Now, trust is also required for specialization, because you must be able to trust people to do things that you haven't bothered studying up. You must also live close to other people in order to access other specialists. Therefore, you need to be able to trust that those people will not do you harm. Otherwise, you're much better off just being a jack of all trades and being a recluse. So humans have evolved to punish people who are trust breakers. This happens through gossip and skepticism, as I'll explain a little later. The other thing that trust requires is predictability. Would you trust somebody who behaves totally randomly? The short answer, I hope, is no. So, actions that follow rules that can be predictable, i.e. a set of rules that you can use in your own mind to work out how another person will react, are much more likely to be trustworthy because you can predict them. So the minimal set of rules for interactions that are good for society is a good basis for an ethical framework, because those are the rules, as you remember from our definition, that help encourage people to be trusting and ethical and moral. So the predictability part requires people to always follow those ethical rules, those rules of ethics. So a society's laws are a codification of its ethics, which are enforced by society. This again comes back to the punishing of people who break trust and are unfair. So trust, fairness, and morality all require evidence. People will not automatically trust another person to be fair and trustworthy and moral unless they have evidence to back it up. I mean, would you take a stranger's word without knowing anything about them? What about the fact, would you trust someone who has breached your trust in the past, or has been unfair in the past, or has broken some other social ethics, i.e. some other social rule? Would you trust such a person? Hopefully the answer would be no. So what about someone who has always demonstrated a commitment to their ethical framework? How about them? Would you trust such a person? Quite likely. So the conclusions I'd like to point out are that trust that people will be moral and fair is key to a fit society from an evolutionary point of view. It's a society where the people can trust people to be moral and fair is a more beneficial society than one where they can't be trusting others to do that. And we've evolved to punish people that are bad for society. Those who are immoral and unfair normally get put away in jail, for example. But the problem is, atheists are generally incorrectly feared by religious people because they are seen to be uncommitted to ethics, i.e. bad for society, which is entirely a misconception. A lot of atheists are actually very much devoted to being ethical and treating society well because we can see the benefits to it. There is good evidence that you should be fair and moral, etc., for society to benefit. An atheist is generally a humanist who values, society in general. But of course, the problem is, from our evolutionary point of view, religious people have always demonstrated commitment to their religion and therefore have a slight edge on atheists because they have demonstrated commitment to things, in particular their religious ethics, which is why religious people tend to think that they are more moral and better for society, which is entirely wrong, because they can often be really bad for society. A religious person's ethics can be really bad for society. So just a final little statement about where I intend taking this series. I'll, of course, in the next part, describe my personal ethical framework, and eventually when I finish describing that, I'll start discussing other people's ethics, and this will lead on to, religious people's ethics and questioning whether they really are good for society. So watch this space for future editions.